The Trauma Effect by Zetta Thomelin. A little from the introduction. I wonder if there's a trauma tucked away in your family. It could be your own experience, or something that has affected someone else, even from long ago. Trauma will often ripple out into a family and affect far more than those directly involved, creating a problem that can last generations. There is a trauma in my family, a hidden trauma. I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to shine a light on what had remained concealed beneath a shroud of shame and consider ways in which it may have affected me. This book reflects that journey from its first tentative steps to ultimately a deep sense of resolution and understanding. I'm telling you my story both to understand it better and to help you to understand yours. Much has been written about the impact of trauma, but when I began to investigate the idea of generational trauma, the trauma within families that in effect gets handed down from one generation to another and so on, I realised at once that there was much less written about that. The old skeleton in the family cupboard, which nobody can talk about, can have a huge impact on the health of a family, both physical and psychological. This is a trauma that is subconsciously gifted to you, so you're not necessarily aware that it's impacting on you, especially if the trauma happened before you were born. Chapter 1, The Photograph. The photograph was always there by my grandmother's bed. It was a black and white photo of a woman in her late 20s with dark waved hair, dark brown eyes, and an almost smile upon her lips as she clutches a baby in her arms. She looks happy and proud. I suppose it speaks for the self-absorbed nature of a child that I never asked about the picture. At some point I knew the woman was my aunt and the baby her child, but I didn't have an aunt on my father's side, so I didn't ask any questions about her, at least not then. When my grandmother died, the picture was moved to my father's bedside, and there it stayed until he died. Then my mother moved it to the lounge where it sits now. I looked at it this evening, marvelling at how I never asked about my missing aunt and the child in her arms. I still don't remember when I was told or how. Yes, I know you might think it would be impossible to forget such a thing. When did they decide it was time to tell me? When they thought I would be old enough to understand? Were they worried I would judge her? She was head girl at her school, you know. My grandmother died when I was 17, and I thought, even though I knew this was not true, that I was her only grandchild. There had been 3 grandchildren before I was even born, you see. I knew the story by then, but still did not think the story was real, though the pictures were always there, and still now, of the woman with the baby in her arms. Chapter 6, The Headlines. As I had failed in my newspaper quest, I looked for a researcher and found a very helpful woman in Canterbury in southeast England who located 5 references in the digitised archives of British newspapers. Sadly, not every paper is there, and the one I wanted most was not. When Elizabeth contacted me and said she had found the headlines, I was shaken. It meant the stories about the tragedy making it to the press were true. It meant I had to read the reports now that I'd come this far, more facing a reality for me. When I knew they were sitting there for me to read in my inbox, I was suddenly unsure. I remember saying, oh my God, several times out loud, and feeling many mixed emotions. Anticipation at finally seeing the truth, fear of what that might be, and of course, some residual guilt at breaking the promise I had made to my father. I had waited to do this for years, to find some real answers. It was now very daunting. Chapter 9, The Impact of Trauma. We have looked at the very personal story of my family trauma to illustrate how a trauma can affect family members from different generations. There's a lot of interest now in generational trauma, sometimes referred to as transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. It's the passing of a traumatic experience down through the generations when the individual suffering has not had the appropriate support for their experience or been able to process it, and is therefore unable to contain the impact of it. We'll be considering whether this kind of inherited trauma is possible, and if that trauma is purely psychological or could have some impact on the physical health of family members. Much of the information and research in this area surrounds Holocaust survivors and is usually the first point of reference for any investigation. It seems to be now generally accepted that there can be a psychological impact which can transfer beyond the first generation. As research has shown, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are 300% more likely to access psychiatric services than the normal level within the population. Chapter 16. What we learn in the transgenerational atmosphere. I want to examine now some of the themes that come out of the transgenerational atmosphere and how they can manifest. These may resonate with anyone who has had trauma within their family in the past or present. Guilt. One of the key issues in a family with trauma is guilt. Guilt at not preventing something happening, guilt at being a survivor, guilt at being relieved it was not you who had suffered, guilt at being relieved that the situation has passed. The most affected by the event will transmit their feelings of guilt into the family, and then it can become a learned pattern for others. Alternatively, sometimes a family member will take on guilt for another who is not owning or has never addressed their own guilt. Indra Torsten Priest addresses this in his work on family constellation therapy.